Welcome everyone to this webinar, this last end of year webinar from us and Evident. Annabelle, my co-founder, and I are delighted to welcome you to this hour of predictions for 2024. I just wanted to give you a sense of sort of what the hour is going to look like. But first, I want to say that we just returned from New York, where we 2 weeks ago held our AI symposium with 200 senior leaders at the intersection of banking and AI, with 2,000 people viewing via the Bloomberg live stream. We had a full day of discussions. We had 10 sessions throughout the day, exploring what it means to be AI first in banking, which got us thinking a lot about where we're headed next and what next year might look like. So today we're going to discuss what lies ahead, looking at the predictions that we have been thinking about and will present to you throughout this hour. But we are also delighted to be joined today by commentators on the banking and AI areas. Mike Mayo, Managing Director of Equity Research at Wells Fargo in the US, and Jeremy Palmer, Chairman of PhysicsX, and previously oversaw Quantum Black, which is McKinsey's AI arm here in the UK, and also worked with many banks. So I'll just quickly take you through what our discussions will rest on, and then hand over to Mike and Jeremy to give their thoughts on sort of where they see the sort of trends and look at what their predictions are before we go into each of the predictions individually. So what we're going to be touching on today is a bit of a range. We're going to be looking at what is the impact of Gen AI. We're going to be looking at the emerging leadership models in the banks that we've seen emerging this year. We're going to be looking at the talent wars in a bit more detail, and look at the growth of AI hires in the context of what's going on more broadly in the banking sector. We're also going to be looking at the mindset shift on the return on investment for AI, and looking at sort of how that shifted in this last year and what we think is going to happen next year and maybe in the coming years. And then we're also going to be looking at how the banks actually might be a blueprint for AI regulation with the EU AI Act and the declaration from the White House, but also what came out of the UK AI Safety Summit. There's a lot of talk about how that's going to impact the business and banking in particular, and how the banking sector actually might be a blueprint for how to think about that. And then we're going to be looking at sort of what does it mean to be leading in the index versus sort of maybe further behind, and is there going to be a bifurcation in the banking sector between the sort of leaders and the laggards? But so before we really dive into that in much more detail, I'd love to hand over first to Mike to give us your thoughts. And welcome, Mike. It's lovely to have you here with us today. It's a real treat. And you were actually at the symposium a couple of weeks ago, so I'd love to get your thoughts on the sector and anything that stood out to you from the symposium itself.
Well, my one-word reaction to the symposium was wow. I could not believe that the number of top bank executives, top technology executives, and other experts in one room for what I saw as the first time ever that sort of gathering of that sort of thought leadership. So that was quite remarkable. You could feel the energy in the room and the sense of change. As far as my reactions from reading evidence research, talking to the largest banks, talking to a range of subject matter experts, I'd say my 3 points are: there's no choice, there's productivity enhancements, and it's next generation technology. So on point one, banks have no choice, and banks really are reacting to the strategy from year 300 BC. So in 300 BC, Plato said that necessity is the mother of invention. And that's where banks stand today. They have no choice. And looking at the US banks, I would say they're facing headwinds. They're facing headwinds from rates. Interest rates showed the greatest increase in 40 years. You have pressures on net interest income, net interest margins, deposit pricing, And that's yet to fully play out. And those are certainly items to watch. The consensus earnings estimate has declined by 20% for US banks in the last 18 months. And so that's a huge headwind rates. The second R would be recession. I think almost everybody expects a slowdown. The question is whether or not we go into a recession. But regardless, that's an extra headwind and you need to offset that. And the third R would be regulation. And in the US, the capital requirements for banks, the debt requirements for banks, the cost to comply are simply going up. So banks need to offset these headwinds. They have no choice. The second point would be productivity. The marriage of banks and techs has been a good one. Over the past decade, productivity per employee has increased by 1/3. And a lot of this is automating the back office, digitizing the front office. I think AI can take both of those to the next level when it's come to automating the back office, things like tech itself. And as was highlighted from the evidence symposium, the ability to just reduce your tech staff and the ability to simply say, okay, change this COBOL code to C++, change that to Python. It's changing the nature of coding in terms of compliance, customer service, the ability to deflect calls. So I think that's all productivity enhancements. I'd say any job at bank that has the word analysis in it is going to be improved. And most jobs have the word analysis in it at a bank. Therefore, AI is going to change most jobs. So at its basic level, regardless of all the debates and everything else, it's an extra tool, just like calculators or computers or spreadsheets or your Bloomberg terminal or data feeds. AI is an extra tool that should make each person at a bank more productive. And the third point would be, this is the next generation, what I term digital banking 2.0. So you're creating new products, services, engagements, and relationships that were previously unavailable in analog form. So you're going from mere automation to actually, creation of new services. And the 4 largest banks in the US have 174 million digital banking customers. Now there's overlap between those banks, but this is the ability to take those 174 million digital customers and give them another level of service. So in short, this is a game changer. I do think it's going to take longer than many expect, but it's something we certainly have to pay attention to. And as an analyst who covers the largest US banks, I'm paying close attention.
Thank you, Mike. And also one of the leading voices on when looking at banks. People really are, they follow you very closely. So it's great to have you here. I don't know, Jeremy, if you had some comments to Mike's points on that he just raised.
Thanks, Alexandra. I think Mike's covered it really. I think the fact that we've seen this game changer in the last 12 months, given the massive take-up of an interest in generative AI, I think it is just worth reflecting on a couple of points around that. The first is that although we've seen this massive acceleration in the last 12 months with the term generative AI and the release of these large language models, I think it really is important to see that in the context of a much longer period of development. And I think especially for the more mature organizations, I think one of the things we'll see is those people who've been laying foundations even before we had this amazing breakthrough with the natural language interface. We're going to see the benefits of that start to come through now. So I think the focus on generative AI is completely appropriate and understandable, but I think we need to see it in the context of the longer run development of what we can do with data thanks to AI. And the sort of foundation laying is super important. And the second thing is, I like the way Mike sort of played between this productivity and innovation point. I think, yes, of course, in the real world, there are these headwinds, these challenges in the external environment. The question is how, and one of those historically, which I think many banks have experienced, is the sort of headwind of the complexity of technology. Legacy stuff, old platforms mixing together, which meant it was very hard to get things like single customer view. And I think the point that Mike made about how we now have new tools to accelerate technology transitions is really interesting. Can we turn that headwind of complexity and an old stack, which is kind of heterogeneous, into a tailwind by saying that now we can solve these problems? We can massively amp up our focus on innovative and engaging customer service. I think seeing it as an opportunity, not just from a productivity point or an efficiency point, but also as a kind of innovation and increasing engagement and customer services, I think is really important. So I'll leave it there for now. There's lots more content you have here, but there's a couple of thoughts there.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jeremy. That's thank you for raising that. It certainly feels like it's, well, as some mentioned at the symposium, this is sort of maybe one of the most important years to date for technology and banking, and so many changes are happening at such a pace, which is what we're trying to keep track of here at Evident. But I'm going to hand over to my co-founder Annabelle, who's going to take us through the first 3 predictions. I'll take you through the last 2 or 3 predictions, depending on how we go with time. But Annabelle, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Alexandra. And thanks everyone for joining us today. And please do weigh in the chat. Our wonderful colleague Lizzie is chat hosting. So if you have any ideas or comments as we go, just drop them in and we'll try and bring you into the conversation. So just on the first prediction, so we've talked a little bit about this year being a bit of a foundational year in terms of AI development and generative AI in particular. But I think that, and particularly in terms of the mindset shift that has led to across the banks, I think to Mike's point about the symposium, the energy, the fact that such a senior group of stakeholders all were in the room together to discuss AI probably hadn't happened before. It is sort of testament to the fact that we've seen that mindset shift. However, I think it's also probably fair to say that it's still a promise in many banks. It's not necessarily yet a reality, particularly when we were looking at and speaking to many of the North American leaders, many of the European leaders at the symposium. Very few banks were saying we've actually got that many use cases in production. I think you've got Morgan Stanley through their partnership with OpenAI talking about their very specific use cases in their wealth management division. We've had some really interesting calls over the last few weeks and months with some Asian players that I think have been a bit more bullish in terms of getting Gen AI use cases into production. So if anyone is on the call from any of the sort of Asian banks, please do weigh in and tell us what you've been doing there. But I think that what we've really seen this year is it's been a year of foundation laying, a year of thinking, okay, what is our vision for AI at our bank? How does that tie to our business strategy? And really thinking about the foundations in terms of, okay, how do we orchestrate this? Who should be running it? And I think next year what we're going to see is many more use cases being put into production and being announced across the banks. And I just thought it was quite interesting when we had different speakers at the symposium, HSBC saying, 3 to 6 months until our sort of first use cases will be in production. And you had some banks that were maybe saying, it's going to be more 12 to 18 months for us. So I think banks are moving at different paces, but this year has definitely been a year of laying foundations, and we expect to see some of that translating into reality next year. And I just finally wanted to touch on the data on the left-hand side. So some of you might have read about it in our key findings report from the index that we updated in November, but we track the job descriptions across all the banks on a monthly basis. And we sort of categorized, various roles over the from May to September. And the number one role sort of grouping that we were looking at that grew the most was generative AI. So generative AI being referenced in the job title or generative AI skills being referenced in the job descriptions. So I think, we're going to be tracking that quite closely, but I think there's been a lot of work going on behind the scenes to think about what talent do I need and how do we set ourselves up to scale generative AI over the course of 2024. Jeremy, I know you have thoughts on this. Is there anything you wanted to add on the Gen AI side?
Thanks, Annabelle. I mean, I think you've said a lot of it. I touched earlier on how we need to see the Gen AI evolution in the context of the broader, longer-term lessons on how we can do so much more with data than we used to be able to, and how machine learning is so valuable, but we're only just figuring it out now that we have this natural language interface. We'll come on to some of these points later, but I think absolutely what I think you've sort of described here is how do we move from the world's greatest ever demo to actually seeing some real value created in sustainable ways with models in production and so on. So I think there's lots of implications there. But I think under that headline, the point is, again, as Mike said earlier, you know, everyone's got to embrace this, and it's going to touch all other areas of our organization. I think I'll just leave it there for now, because behind this point is a lot of the other ones you're about to talk about: talent, how we organize, how we see value, how we think end to end now, how we move from a sort of project mindset to a product mindset. All those kind of things sort of hang off this point. So I'll leave it there, and then maybe jump in again later on some of the other sub points.
Yeah, Jeremy, I was just going to ask one more question of Jeremy. Just, are there any
Sure.
which Gen AI use cases are you most excited about? I guess from your experience working with the banks and being at McKinsey for so many years.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, in my own experience as a banker, and then you know, in QB and McKinsey, of course, you know, what you're always a lot depends on where you're in the cycle, and whenever you're in a sort of cost focused cycle, then everyone's going to focus on productivity, and when you're in a growth cycle, everyone's going to focus about how we can, you know, get new revenue streams. And I think, you know, for me, the point is to see those two categories at the same time, because while you will have one focus or another at any one time, having the skills organized in such a way as that you can point them at either, I think is really important. But I mean, what I'm most excited by in the long term is the combination of you know, moving to being able to really change the way customers engage with the organization. I think in the short term, there's going to be focus on costs. There's going to be focus on efficiency. We know we can automate. We know now we have machines which can read faster and better. So a lot of compliance and a lot of KYC and a lot of risk issues can be accelerated. But I'm really excited in the longer run by what Mike talked about, this transition to sorting your data and your infrastructure out, and from there enabling really innovative and engaging ways of developing customer relationships, providing people with useful ideas about their personalized situation, and really thinking about how we can get away from the paradigm where we, you know, in a lot of time in banking, we relied on the natural stickiness of the customer, because people naturally, you know, take a while before they change relationships, turning that into something much more positive, where we give people positive reasons to stay with us, because we now have this ability through AI, through data, through machine learning and all these skills to show them things they didn't even know about themselves, and how we can help them, and how your relationship with a bank can be a great experience and not what is often, frankly, still a frustrating experience for many of them.
Before we go to the next prediction, I wonder, Mike, did you want to come in and comment on that? I mean,
breaking news at your conference 2 weeks ago, JP Morgan expects revenues from AI in this coming year. And second, recently, the head of asset servicing for BNY Mellon said that they've gotten more utility out of AI in the last 3 months than they got from the iPhone in the last decade.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a statement.
And the only sorry, I love those points, Mike. The only thing I would say is, just to sort of put a supercharger on that, is, in my view, we're still right at the very, very beginning here of what's possible. So I think the point about this being a non-optional opportunity, we all have to embrace it. You know, you do have to have that ambitious mindset, and to recognize that we're going to have to move very fast to keep up with it. But the best is yet to come. But we are starting to see real value, Mike. I think it's a great point.
But maybe a quick question from my end to both of you, is that when we launched in January and ChatGPT had been released a couple of months before that, there was an expectation that the use cases going into production would emerge in sort of Q3, Q4, but it has taken longer. A lot of banks, banks out there with some use cases in production, mainly in the sort of back end, not customer focused yet or facing yet. And some banks like Goldman Sachs came out, Marco Agenti, to say, we're actually just not ready to do it yet. We're too many things that we need to iron out. And at the same time, there seems to be, just in the last couple of months, this acceleration of, actually, we're now stopping the testing and really able to put this into production, hence this prediction of we're going to see it going into reality and a lot more announcements being made on Gen AI use cases in production. But I'm just wondering if you had any comments on this timeline. Is this going to be a sudden gate, floodgate opening? Is it still going to be a bit longer and tougher to get your, everything lined up in order to get the most benefit out of Gen AI? Just maybe if you've got a view on sort of the, the time frame for many use cases in production and a time frame for sort of, ROI from them. Is that next year, or is that actually in 2025 or 26?
Do you want to go first, Mike?
I was going to let you go first.
Okay, all right, I'll go first. I mean, I'm going to be really annoying in saying I think it's going to be a little bit of both. And I refer back to what I was saying earlier. I mean, one of the lessons, everyone on this call knows this, but if you look at any kind of value creation ecosystem end to end, where really you're just trying to take a lot of data and to turn it into useful insights, the machine learning model, which everyone really focuses on, is actually a relatively small part of the whole end-to-end system. So the people who are going to be, I think, able to move faster to production at scale are going to be the ones who have that end-to-end view and have that architecture, that whole view of their tech stack. So they're thinking about data, they're thinking about data quality and data architecture and data governance. They're also thinking about the front end and visualization and how we can actually take these outputs from these models and make them consumable, in the right context by the right user. But if you have got those things in place, if you have been doing this for some time, and that's where I say I think we have to see this in the context of the longer run, then I think you can move much faster now, because Gen AI can be pointed at all sorts of individual problems. But if you haven't yet got that fundamental stuff in place around data architecture and things like that, then it is still going to take a bit longer. So I would say the big question really is, I think you talk about this later on, is there's a natural effect where, although we've had a lot more focus on it in the last 12 months, the people who are leading already and can keep their focus on and do all the good things you talk about here with the people and the talent, the organization, they will accelerate. And I think you will see them come through this year. The challenge is going to be for the others is to your point earlier, there's a lot of difficult questions. How much core capability is going to be open sourced? How much you need to build in-house, and those kind of decisions. And if you're still in the early days, the foothills of building the end-to-end architecture, then it's still going to take a bit longer, and it's going to still be frustrating. This stuff isn't easy. And, when you think about the risks, you think about the regulations, you think about all of the stuff around data and so on. If you haven't been thinking about those things for a while, it's very hard to accelerate. But I think you will see acceleration. You will definitely see more value from the leaders. But I think it's going to be a while before, if you're starting from scratch today, it's going to be a while before you get to having hundreds of models in production. That would be my answer. Mike, over to you. I'm
not sure what date you just gave, Jeremy, but I'm going to take Jeremy's date plus 1 day, because I like trying to win these competitions. So on the one hand, anything that's not customer facing, automating the back office, sure, here and now. Anything that's customer facing or pricing or germane to the core of banking, you don't want to be that first bank on the front page of the New York Times that has an AI issue with your know your customer. So from that standpoint, I'm just going to push back a little bit later on anything that's germane to customers and their banking.
That's great. Thank you so much. I know we've got a lot of predictions to get through, so I'm going to hand it back to Annabelle for prediction, the second prediction that we have in store for you.
We are totally going to run out of time, as expected. So I think we just had a really good conversation about obviously the year of generative AI and the mindset shift that's led to across the banks, and also the fact that a lot of banks have been organising themselves over the past year. And I think that our second prediction is really around sort of what leadership is going to look like in the next year. And on the left-hand side here, you can see that there are now 4 out of, we cover 50 banks, so 45 in North America and Europe, 5 in Asia Pacific. And across those 50 banks, we've got 4 banks where there is a sort of AI leader or chief data and analytics officer on the operating committee or the executive team. And our prediction for next year is that we're going to see this increase. So, we've seen over the last year, banks really investing in sort of their strategy, their vision. I think we're seeing individuals being sort of appointed to sort of spearhead the strategy across the bank. I think that those roles are going to be elevated up to the most senior level. Obviously, AI is a CEO level agenda item, but I think banks are going to be increasingly hiring the sort of senior AI leaders at the top level. And I think that's for sort of a really good reason as well, which is to A, sort of make sure that they are at the highest level, they have the power to sort of drive the agenda across the group and sort of make things happen. But I think also many banks are looking at them as the kind of point person for their external narrative and positioning around AI, which is something that we also think over the last year, we've seen massively increase the emergence of more and more AI-related announcements, obviously on use cases specifically, but also about strategy and vision and ROI as a whole. And that's becoming more and more prominent in investor materials, in press releases, on social media, etc. So I think that the emergence of these people on the executive team is A, recognition of the fact this is now such a senior high-level agenda item, B, because it's being centralized under an individual leader, and C, because they're looking for someone to spearhead the external narrative of the bank as well. And then just finally to touch on the point on the right-hand side, I think it's more than just an executive team sort of issue or priority. There's going to be a big focus on training of board directors as well. To be able to govern and to be able to ask the right questions of the executive team requires increased education and understanding of what AI is and the impact that it's going to have. So we're expecting to see more board director appointments with AI expertise and more training as well. I don't know, Alexandra, back to you. Do you want to?
Well, I guess it goes back touching on this question about time. I mean, a lot of this centralization and the way that the banks are reorganizing themselves is, to Annabelle's point, this question around getting this time to production down is one of the things, right? And to have a much better overview of the needs of the bank. But I don't know if Jeremy or Mike, if you had thoughts about, from what you're seeing, what creates the best and most nimble operating model from your perspective.
Well, I think it starts with the tone at the top, and the tone at the top starts with the CEO, starts with the executive committee. When I go to meet with banks and there's senior executives, I always want to see if they are on message. Do they have the same story? Are they cohesive with their strategy? So I think it's noteworthy that, like JP Morgan is the only US bank with someone on their executive committee, that they're sending a message to everybody who works there, to all 250,000 plus employees. So I think it's the symbolism and the direction of the strategy that's important. Yeah.
Jamie, do you have any comments on this one?
No, I think Mike's exactly right. I'm a little bit nervous about the idea that you name a role and suddenly the whole thing's done. I think actually setting the tone is really important, as Mike says. For some people, they already have a center of excellence, which is making sure that standards are maintained across the whole organization. Others are more distributed, and you might have someone in retail and someone in CIB and someone in markets or whatever. So a lot depends again where you're starting from. But the tone from the top is super critical. And then also, I think it's just like, to me, it's more important to just, really find great examples of value creation and then make sure that they're appropriately embedded. And then the lessons from them are then shared across the rest of the organization so you can move faster. So I think it's that built-in acceleration. And a lot of that comes from tone. Of course, it helps if you've got someone driving it. But I think there are other factors as well as that.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And also just to that point that you raised right there about showing the value creation and the whole process, getting it from production, getting it into production and being able to showcase that across the bank. But that does require a centralized system and some centralization of that so it can get distributed across the bank. But I think we will just move on to our next prediction. Back to you, Annabelle.
I don't know whether you saw that there was a nice question from Sam in the chat, which the AI officer role has recently been talked about, a sort of necessary new position. What would you do? What would your first reactions be if you were an AI officer? I don't know whether Jeremy, if you had any thoughts on that one, that would be quite an interesting one if you were sort of brought in. I guess it probably depends on the context of the bank.
Yeah, it does. It's a great question, Sam. I mean, look. There's three big questions. I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I mean, if you assume that means that assume it goes. Of course, it could be, as long as it is broadly framed and it isn't just focusing on risk. And I think we need to know a bit more about that, Sam, in terms of how the regulators are pursuing it. But broadly speaking, it's got to be about I would say two things. Firstly, it's like, are we clear what value is? And across the organization, do we at least have a path towards a roadmap so that we actually really know front, middle, and back where the opportunities are? Two, absolutely risk training end to end. And I think the third thing is kind of a bit of a weird one, but I would definitely, like all these big roles, I would spend a lot of time making sure that the CEO and the board were very, very clear about the remit and the role description, and that you could build proper partnerships with all the right groups of the bank, because kind of again, to Mike's point, getting things done in these large organizations depends a lot on tone from the top as well. So maybe those three things: value, risk, and then the right kind of collaboration across the organization. Does that make sense, Mike?
Right. Okay. So, Mike, did you want to comment, or should we jump on to the next?
Yeah, let's move along.
Okay, let's
Great.
move along. Back to you,
Right.
Annabelle.
Next one, talent. Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting one. We've obviously seen, and Mike, you mentioned the kind of headwinds facing the sector over the last year. But I think that what we've found in the sort of index and looking at the data is that we've seen a 10% growth in AI talent between May and September of 2023. So AI talent in its broadest definition, by which we mean AI development, model risk, data engineering, and a whole range of sort of AI-focused implementation roles has grown significantly. But it's obviously not completely even across the board. And on the left-hand side here, you can see sort of there are two dimensions. The x-axis is really the absolute change in volume. So how many individuals have entered into AI development teams at each bank. And you can see JP Morgan's furthest on the right-hand side. They've added about 200 AI development positions between May and September. BBVA in the UK, in sort of Spain, doubling down, HSBC in the UK. And then the y-axis is really looking at the change in density, which is almost a reflection of how much are they hiring AI development talent relative to the rest of their workforce as a whole. So Capital One, the fact their density has increased the most, means they've been hiring specifically in these AI development positions faster than the overall bank's headcount. I think UBS is a really interesting one because they obviously had their major acquisition of Credit Suisse in the summer. And we've seen as a result of that acquisition a sort of an actual growth in the overall AI teams across the UBS Credit Suisse whole. And whilst the rest of the bank is experiencing, cost reduction efforts, there's actually that AI team has been growing and has been protected. And that's why you can see their density of AI talent increasing relative to their total workforce. I think what we're going to see next year is that's going to only continue. I think there is this war for talent that George Lee talked about from Goldman Sachs at the symposium. But I think there's also a question of what do we really mean by AI talent? And I know that Mike and Jeremy will no doubt want to weigh in on this. But just an anecdote from the symposium was sort of talking within the AI development pool specifically, the difference between a data scientist and a sort of AI research expert. And some of the banks many of the North American banks like JP Morgan, RBC, TD, Morgan Stanley, they've been building AI research units to try and rival big tech. And that is a talent war in itself, trying to recruit talent that might otherwise be trying to go to OpenAI or Microsoft or Google. And so there's that sort of war for AI expertise. And then there's a broader war for talent, I think, around sort of AI development talent as a whole. But it does raise questions with generative AI, where, A, what do we mean by AI talent and is that changing? And B, will generative AI actually maybe reduce the need and requirements for talent in some of these areas, for example, on the sort of software developer and engineering side? I don't know, Jeremy, I know you always have thoughts on talent and the definitions and sort of...
Maybe if I can start
Mike,
at the high level.
Mike,
I'll start at the
first.
high level and let Jeremy go into the details.
Great.
But at a high level, I got really worried thinking about the banks and the war on talent and how they're going to keep up with this spending war. My view is Goliath is winning. The largest banks are winning. One reason, evident you've been successful is because it creates a virtuous cycle. The more that CEOs talk about AI as a strategy, and the more you have AI heads on the executive committee, the more they talk about it with investors and analysts, the more awareness there is in the public, and there's more potential to actually hire AI talent. So I find that virtuous cycle, quite intriguing. On the other hand, I just don't know how banks compete with technology firms. And when you're spending up to $1 million for, an AI expert, it gets pretty tough. I don't have a solution. I think that is a potential bottleneck. But Jeremy?
Well, I haven't got much to add. I know we've got a lot more to get through. I mean, talent is everything. People are everything. But we all know the stories of the 10x engineers and so on. I mean, the right talent is more important than the volume. I think inevitably it's this part of the game is weighted towards the bigger players. The only other thing I'd say is that I think the skill mix is changing already over the last few years that you need. We talk about data scientists, but we also have data engineers who are incredibly important, machine learning engineers, and then maybe do you include designers in this space and so on. So I think you need to be quite granular when you talk about talent. And then the last thing I'd say is that I also think we're moving more and more towards, in terms of actual value and product penetration, moving more towards building things for end users as opposed to experts. So I think actually there's an important role of someone who is maybe not necessarily an AI expert according to their CV or their qualifications, but really understands, adoption. Let me just leave it with this. For me, adoption is always, as some of you have heard me say before, is at least as important as the technology itself. So you need people thinking about that part of it and not just the technology.
And on one last point, George Lee of Goldman Sachs mentioned at your conference, he thought there's a little bit of resume inflation. Yeah. All these people all of a sudden add AI to their CV.
Yeah, .ai works every time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, exactly.
Jeremy.ai. I'm going to rebrand myself. Jeremy.ai. Yeah.
There was also the comment from Jeff McMillan at Morgan Stanley, who runs wealth management, or the sort of AI side of that, and he was very clear that it is with Gen AI, and he spent a lot of time on implementing Gen AI with a very early partnership with OpenAI, so before the release of ChatGPT, and that partnership was brought in to support the wealth management team to make the financial analysts more effective. Just to your point before, Mike, in terms of efficiency gains, that was sort of they announced that, and I know you follow that closely too, with the expectation of, what was it, 30-40% increase in productivity. But his point was that it is that end user, to your point, Jeremy, in terms of just being able to go in and utilize this and be able to understand what it is you actually need to get out of it is more important. So that skill set.
Yeah, I mean, just for example, there was a great question just now about prompt engineers. I mean, my personal view is that it is a fad. I would much rather train a really smart domain expert to figure out how to interface with the model than to have a new category called prompt engineer. And I think that's where we'll end up, in my view. And that's an example of that.
Yeah, that's exactly what Jeff McMillan said too. One thing, maybe just a quick comment on sort of there's the talent capabilities that we measure in the index, and then there's the talent development, which is all about, dedicated hiring and skills and training that the bank provides. And I think that, this war on talent is hotting up. Talent has a lot of other places to go. It could go to big tech, it could go to consultancies, it can go to other banks, frankly. So the question of what the banks offer, we hear at least over and over again, is how important it is to get, if you want that right talent in of a certain caliber, that you need to be able to offer the things that they want to be able to do, i.e. produce research or be part of filing a patent, be active on open source is very important for AI talent, being able to participate in conferences, having partnerships with universities, so there's that funnel between academia and the bank itself. And the banks that have strong AI talent say that that's absolutely essential. So that's one of the things that we're also looking out for, and we do see some changes in that already, in terms of banks expressing a bit more or becoming a bit more thoughtful about, maybe we need to be more visible for exactly those reasons, to make it attractive place for AI talent to come, because we're going to be offering this, we're going to show that AI is core to the business, that it's a priority for the bank, and so on. So that's something I think we expect to see much more of, banks being more vocal on those kinds of that kind of environment that's good for AI talent, and I think we believe that that's going to be even more important going on, because the AI talent pool is quite small, as we talked about before. And so, and they want to work on interesting interesting use cases and be able to leave with a track record that's in the public space. So that's quite important. Anyway, should we maybe flip to the fourth prediction? We'll see how far we can get. We've only got about 15 minutes left. This is also something we've really seen a big change this year. But briefly, what we've seen is that mindset shift in the banks. We can see it both in what's being expressed, but also from the conversations that we're having in terms of moving from a what can AI do to what is the return on investment and what value does it create for the banks? It's not that hasn't been front and center from the start, but definitely when, some years ago, when banks were starting to invest in AI was much more of an experimental phase that they went into. And now that phase seems to have come to an abrupt end this year, depending on where you are in your AI adoption journey, but very much a sort of a hard look at this return on investment and the value created for the banks and how does this impact the bottom line. We have been starting to look at the correlation between doing well on the index, i.e. having a high level of AI maturity versus performance of sort of traditional financial KPIs. And we're sort of beginning to see this positive correlation emerge, which is interesting, something we're obviously going to track very closely in the years ahead. But maybe also just to flag that we did produce a outcomes report last month that was looking at what are the ways in which that the banks are organizing for outcome and for measurement of return on investment. And there's definitely a sort of an acceleration of centralizing decision making on this to be, and we were talking about that in the beginning, of being able to be much faster at identifying mapping and measuring and ideating, prioritizing, and then putting it into use cases, into operation, and getting value out of that. So centralizing this decision-making process, having a use case repository, identifying where that gives you most value, is something we're seeing changing a lot in the banks, and the banks really focusing on how to do that best. So I don't know, I'm going to hand that over. I don't know, Mike, you look like you've unmuted yourself and you're ready with a comment on that.
Yeah, I just want to know how I should change my earnings models for the banks. Should I be increasing my revenues now? It seems like more likely I'll be increasing my expense estimates, which is not what we want to see. So the two most important words on this slide here, self-funded, that's what I want to see, because yeah. I'm optimistic long-term, and maybe long-term isn't as long as I think, but I'm cynical and skeptical in the short term that you're going to see really positive ROIs. I've seen too much. The dot-com bubble 1.0 back in 1999, you had internet banks, you had blockchain. I know there's use cases, but in terms of the ROI and even cloud the last few years, there's been a little bit of buyer's remorse. So I know AI is different in some ways, but, and some banks will get it right, but it's not one size fits all. And I'll believe the ROI is a little bit more when I see them.
Yeah, no, I think there's also this question of pressures from shareholders, and because it is an immense amount of cost, to your point, there's a lot of, what did JP Morgan spend this year? 14 billion on tech and AI overall. That's a significant spend, and other banks are spending similarly, in proportion figures. And so there is that expectation of being able to demonstrate what you get, what's the efficacy of that AI investment. But I think the question, Annabelle and I have seen this year, is through our many conversations, is this question of self-funding. And the banks are talking about that would be ideal if we can reap the benefits, but reinvest that into the bank, reinvest that into our AI capabilities and our, putting AI into production. Jeremy, you have a point on that?
No, I think, Mike, I completely agree. One has to be skeptical. At the same time, one has to see this whole ecosystem, right? There was a question earlier about business model transformation based on AI combined with other tech, cloud, data governance, all of these things are essential enablers. However, if you have done a lot already to get those things in place, then I think you can accelerate to value quite fast. Self-funding from scratch today in legacy tech environments is going to be really, really hard. But if you've already sorted out your data and you can absolutely are ready to go, then I think you'll see, but Mike, I think you'll see self-funding in ways that are quite hard for banks to get to. For example, if I can see people, places where people have done a lot of work on organizing their data and they have their customer data in a CLV type organization and they're ready to go, you can move very fast to use Gen AI and other things to generate very targeted messaging that can then massively reduce your marketing spend, for example, because you can do test and learn on a much more dynamic basis. And then you're able to say, actually, in spending $500 million promoting mortgages this year, randomly, I'm actually going to spend, 100 million in a very targeted way. Is that a saving? I don't know. Yes, it is, but you need to have all of those other things in place to be able to realize that saving. And I think it's going to take a while for most people.
I'm going to ask a question to Jeremy. So, Jeremy, what's your prediction for when I need to change, sorry, my earnings estimate by 5 cents higher? When do you think I'll do that for the first time?
I think for most banks, you're more than 12 months away from that.
All right, so but sometime in early 2025, we can.
I would say if banks haven't got a path to that in 2025, if they can't actually see how they're bringing together this whole value chain, so not just Gen AI or one part of AI, but with cloud, with a modern stack, with data properly organized, and their organization reflecting that, so you can actually look end to end at how workflows change as a result of this stuff between compliance and marketing and customer facing people. If you can do all those things, then I think you can get stuff in 2025. But that's not going to be very many. So I would say I would be asking that question, Mike, if I were you.
Yeah.
Don't say I said that. Don't say I said that. I don't know. That's just my view.
Can I add one more thing, which I've just put a quote in the chat from Jeff McMillan at Morgan Stanley from the symposium, where he was talking about their early partnership with OpenAI and their use case. And he said, we didn't put economic KPIs against our early Gen AI pilots because the goal was learning. And I don't know whether that's something that we're now it isn't going to cut the mustard from next year, and it's all going to be much more ROI focused and self-funded. But I just thought that was an interesting alternative perspective, basically.
Yeah.
Well, the environment drives that, and I think Mike's right. I mean, if people are focused on, managing risk as the economy turns down and losses go wrong or whatever, that's tough to go on saying we're just learning. It's fine. We're investing in learning. I mean, it depends a lot on the overall environment and context.
For the CEOs, there is no long term unless you get through the short term.
That is very true. I mean, it goes to sort of actually our last prediction. In terms of we were looking at, and maybe actually a question to you, Jeremy, is you were saying before, if you haven't really got a handle on sort of the end to end, right, and the whole, that this really is a group wide, it has to be infused across the bank, it has to be all tied up, otherwise it's just really hard to get the value out of it. If you haven't started, because we were looking at sort of leaders and laggards, and if you're not, and thinking the gap between the two may increase a lot in the next couple of years. I guess maybe just a question back to you on that. Do you think maybe the banks that don't have their a handle on this may go out of business in the next 4 to 5 years? I mean, it seems that they will.
I don't know. I think you're just missing out. If you think about, I mean, I think people are very excited about Gen AI, and it's understandable. But banks have been trying to work with machine learning models for a long time, right? And there are some organizations, there aren't very many, but there's some where they've had a few models in operation for a while. But if you look at this, what does it take to run a lot of models? You don't want to be rebuilding that capability. So if you have like an MLOps capability for model management, which you've already deployed in how you run your risk models, the question is, how can you take that capability and apply it in other parts of the organization where you're going to be running models around customer facing or around middle office or whatever? So it's thinking about the kind of overall kind of architecture, the full stack that you need, and not reinventing things all over the place. So common standards, production ready code everywhere, reusable components, all these kind of things. So you want to make sure the investment can be carried across the whole organization, I guess is my point.
Right. Well, thanks so much. Maybe we should quickly skip to the next prediction, number 5. Conscious that we've only got 9 minutes left, so we might not get to the 6th one. But just on this one, I think, so what we've seen is I mean, it's an interesting time to be discussing this prediction, just because the EU AI Act came out and got, cleared on Friday, and there's been so much activity both in the US and the UK. A lot of eyes of what's going to emerge in terms of regulating AI. Is it right now the focus is very much on the existential risk perspective and like how we create guardrails around that. And so the thinking is, that long-term risk and how do we get in front of that now versus what are the various sectors facing today when implementing AI, and then through obviously observing this particular sector for a while now and being such a heavily regulated sector that has so many controls in place and oversight, from model development to sort of putting it into deployment, testing it, and sending it out to the regulators. There is a lot of oversight that might be something that could be a blueprint for how to think about AI regulation at a sectoral level for the unregulated sectors. This could be a way to think about it. Maybe just one final point, and I'd love your comments from people on the call as well. One of the things that we're seeing is a lot more visibility on what's going on in this responsible AI space. It is a pillar. It's the fourth pillar in our index. It's not weighted very highly. We weigh it at 10%. It's really capturing the expression of what's going on at the bank above and beyond what the banks are required to do in terms of the regulatory requirements. And so we capture the banks that are putting out sort of principles, what they're hiring for in terms of responsible AI, but also looking at sort of research and development in this space that the banks are leading. And again, it's a very nascent area of reporting. We do think that this is going to increase over time because of the pressure not only from shareholders, but from clients as well. But what we have seen since the January release till this release in this edition in November is an almost 50% increase in activity of what banks are putting out on responsible AI. And I just thought that was really interesting to observe. And from that, we do expect, for a number of reasons, that this is only going to continue. And actually, all of the blank spaces that we have in the index of banks not speaking out or talking about what they're doing on the responsible AI agenda is going to be filled out. But I don't know in terms of, from Mike and Jeremy and others in the room, where you see this might go, both from what might come out from the regulators. Are they going to be looking at the sector for ideas and in terms of blueprint? And what do you think the bank's response is going to be to the regulation that we're seeing coming out of the EU and US? I don't know, Mike, if you have any perspective from the US in particular.
I was hoping Jeremy was going to bail me out there. I just think the most noteworthy comment from your symposium 2 weeks ago is not what will regulators, allow banks to do, but will they not allow banks to do, because the bad actors will have AI, and that can cause new and additional cyber and fraud concerns. So if the banks aren't prepared against these new threats, then that could be a bigger risk than not allowing banks to move forward.
Yeah, that was a very good point. I don't know, Jeremy, if you have any comments on this point.
I mean, you have 4 minutes left. It's a big topic. I'm not a deep expert on regulation, but I will say that I think you have to be super focused on the fact that if you can't explain what you're doing to yourself, you probably can't explain it to others. And so, that's my watchword here. You have to assume there's going to be more of a spotlight on this. You have to assume that, and I would also say that it goes across into the whole trust agenda from a customer-facing perspective as well. So it's no wonder to me people do reference it. You will hear more. It's an evolving space. You just got to stay close to it.
Yeah.
And I can comment for 1 minute on your prediction 6, just so you get to it.
Oh, okay. Let's go to prediction 6. I mean, this is the whole bifurcation question. This is a bonus prediction. And the question about sort of, is this gap going to grow? And Mike, would love your comment on this, because this is more of is it a prediction, or is it more of a question we are asking ourselves right now, as in, can you keep up if you're very far behind? Is there a second move advantage? Over to you, Mike.
So I'll answer a question with a question, and that is,
Thank you.
First, Goliath is winning. So the largest banks have the scale. There's 174 million reasons why the 4 largest banks will win, because they have 174 million digital banking customers already. But my question is, as I learned at your conference, this leapfrog potential, your potential to take antiquated back offices and have them skip a generation, use the data much more quickly. Will that allow a second mover advantage or allow the laggards to catch up? I don't know.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you,
would
Mike.
only add,
Go ahead.
I agree with Mike. I would only add that I said it already earlier on, but I think people who focus on adoption as much as on technology will move faster than people who just focus on technology. So where can we get traction quickest with users, clients, customers internally, whatever? Let's move fast with them. So I think the path to acceleration is not just having the best tech people. It's having that leadership from the top that Mike talked about, and a focus on adoption rather than just being the smartest people in the room. If we don't have an impact on others, then we're just entertaining ourselves with this investment. So let's get to that adoption point as fast as we can.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, this whole adoption focus. I know we've only got 1 minute left, so maybe we will leave it here for today and thank everyone. Maybe just Annabelle and I, maybe some quick sort of, well, it's been a big year. It's been a big year for us. It's been a big year for the AI community and the banking sector as well. It feels monumental in some, and I don't know how many listened in to the symposium, but Manuela Veloso was quite struck by being maybe a little bit laissez-faire about it in the beginning of the year, and then really sinking into that this is actually really pivotal, and we feel it as well, also because there's a lot of interest in seeing, looking at the capabilities in the investment, but to your point, Jeremy, also really getting your head around putting it into production, and this sort of focus on value and how we do that best. But the year ahead is going to be 2024. We'll definitely come back and revisit how accurate or inaccurate we've been on our predictions, and we'll hold ourselves to account. And we've got a big program for 2024 with a symposium like the one we did in New York. We'll be doing in London in June. We'll repeat the New York Symposium in November in New York. Next year, we'll be doing lots of roundtables. We'll be doing in-person events. And just as importantly, we'll be tracking everything that we do in real time and producing monthly reports on sort of what's going on in the space to really make sure that everyone is kept abreast. Those who want to sign up for that, kept abreast of what's going on in this sector, keeping an eye on who's announcing what's going on in the talent space, who's the research and the patents, the leadership, and we're going to be tracking that throughout the year. But as I said, on a monthly basis, we'll surface that data, and as well as our deeper reports. So please do. I'll hand over to Annabelle for a final note. If you wanted to also say. Put in your comments, but just thank you for everyone for joining this webinar today. And we look forward to seeing you all again early in the new year.